Hi, it's Emil Guillermo, the host of the PETA Podcast. We're traveling this week, so enjoy this reprise from a few years back. The time frame may be different, but the observations and how to address the problems are still at play when it comes to addressing the character and psychological makeup of vivisectors, animal abusers, and animal experimenters funded by the U.S. government. All that on this reprise of the PETA Podcast with Emil Guillermo. Vivisectors harm animals. Will they harm people? The only way to know is to test the vivisector. What evil lurks within? PETA found more than a dozen cases. Sex, violence, and vivisection. Next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. On today's episode, psychological profiles of vivisectors. Should we demand them before giving them tens of millions in research dollars? PETA has sent a letter to the Department of Health and Human Services to make psychological testing of vivisectors mandatory. So far, no answer from the department. But consider this. FBI profilers know that violent serial killers usually started small by torturing animals. What would a psychological profile reveal about the research scientists whose careers involve cruelly abusing animals? Does that behavior indicate something outside the lab that we should worry about? PETA research found at least 17 cases of vivisectors involved in violent crimes like rape and even murder. These were all respected scientists funded with your tax dollars, but who showed an evil streak that took them from the laboratory to prison. One researcher explained his crime with this admission: "I just did it. Something in me was evil." When science is bad for the animals and worse for the humans. Here's my conversation with PETA Senior VP Kathy Guillermo on the PETA Podcast. And as a warning, there will be references to sexual assault and murder and molestation.
As I watched Netflix Mindhunters, a program about the FBI's psychological profiling of serial killers, a light bulb went off in my head. And I began to see that there were certain parallels between the kinds of personality traits that they described in some criminals and, forgive me, in other people, including people who experiment on animals. And I began to be curious about that. We know there's already a link between people who harm animals and then go on to harm other people. That is one of the issues that the FBI looks for in murderers and in criminals. Have they tormented, tortured, or killed animals? So there's already that link. But I wondered, could it be true that in some cases, people who experiment on animals have found an acceptable way to work out their own psychological problems? And so I began to look into it.
All right, now when you say Netflix, as soon as you say Netflix or a Netflix series, you lose a little credibility because people will say, "That's Netflix, that's fiction, that's not real."
And that's completely understandable. And I'm not suggesting that what I'm talking about is directly applicable. It was simply the beginning of an idea. The series that I was watching was a fictionalized version of how the FBI developed its crime profiles. And I asked myself a question. Is it possible that there are some people who have experimented on animals and then gone on to commit violent crimes against human beings? Did they start with animals and then not stop outside the laboratory door? It was a simple question, and honestly, I didn't know what the answer was. But what I found is, yes, indeed. And almost immediately, we turned up 17 such individuals, some of them horrific experiments on animals, and then turned violent towards humans as well.
So Netflix was a jumping off point. You didn't know what you were going to discover. And you did the research and you found 17 examples?
17 people. That's right. And one of them was an individual whose crimes against humans we actually exposed, we at PETA. after uncovering them in court documents. The others I didn't know about. And it was really shocking to me to discover them. And one of the things that really disturbed me about this is that we found that in many cases, the scientific community cloaked these people. They enabled them to carry on in some cases with their harassment, with their abuse of other individuals without being questioned.
Wait, cloaked? That makes it sound a little bit like the Catholic Church protecting priests.
It's a very apt comparison, frankly. I mean, let's take one example. There is a man who conducted experiments on monkeys that some people are familiar with. He took one monkey in a cage and he put another monkey in a cage nearby. The experiment was to see that if one monkey was to take a bite of food, then the other monkey had to deliver a painful shock to that monkey in order to obtain his food. So people have heard about this because a similar experiment was done with human beings. So just to set this up properly, if a monkey wanted to eat, he had to pull a lever. And when that lever dropped the food, it shocked another monkey that was visible to this first one. And what this man, whose name was Jules Mosserman, found out is that the monkey would go hungry rather than hurt the other monkey that he could see in another cage. He did similar horrible experiments on cats. He put cats in cages and made sure that if they were going to eat, the only way they could do it was to be abused, to be shocked, or to be harmed in some way. And so if the only way you could eat was if you also got an electric shock, you can imagine what that does to an individual.
And you found all these experiments how and where?
Well, these are published experiments. He was quite well known at the time. He was a very well-known analyst. He was the head of the American Psychological Association, which is a very prominent group. He was the president of that, as well as the American Academy of Psychoanalysis. And he did these experiments and he wrote these papers. So that's very much out there in the public eye. What was also out in the public eye some years ago, in the 80s and the early 90s, is that he was accused by some of his patients of raping them, of giving them drugs and taking advantage of them in therapy sessions. And he was accused by one woman who eventually took him to court. He was then accused by 3 other women. And rather than face what the charges were, he simply gave up his medical license to practice. And so this was just one incident of an animal experimenter out of quite a few others we turned up.
All right. So now someone might say, okay, that's kind of a coincidence. He was accused of rape, or these rape allegations came up, and he also did these experiments. They have no connection.
Well, perhaps they had no connection. Perhaps they did. But let's take a look at Tracy McIntosh. Tracy McIntosh was the director of the University of Pennsylvania Head Injury Clinical Research Laboratory. And longtime PETA supporters will remember the Penn Head Wound Laboratory from the 80s, when PETA released a video that was given to us of experiments inside this laboratory in which baboons' heads were smashed. They were cemented, literally cemented inside a helmet. A hydraulic pump came down and smashed the heads. And then the experimenters and their staff were filmed making fun of the brain-damaged baboons. It was an enormous scandal. The funding for this laboratory was pulled. It continued in other forms, and it was run by a man named Tracy McIntosh. And he used cats and he used rats. For just one example, with anesthetized rats, he folded back their scalps and he cemented caps to their tiny little skulls. And you can see it's very similar to what was done to baboons by other experimenters, and then subjected them to pressurized pulses that deformed their brains. He got $17 million in public funding for his experiments. He was an experimenter, an animal experimenter, in very good standing. But in 2003, he was arrested for the alleged rape of a Penn veterinary student. And this young woman was the niece of a good friend of his. And we looked at the court records and the media coverage. He apparently offered to show this young woman around the city and the campus that night. And she accepted gratefully, and then she says she began to feel strange and out of it while she was having drinks at a restaurant with him. And she later accused him of giving her Nembutal, a date rape drug that he used in his own lab to kill rats he experimented on. And the victim says eventually he took her back to his laboratory and she remembers him raping her. He pleaded no contest to this. And it was one count of sexual assault. And this is what I mean by being protected by the research industry. The judge said, and I quote, that he had factored in McIntosh's important work with stroke victims and brain injuries, and he sentenced him to house arrest for a couple of years. And there was such a huge outcry about that the sentencing was redone and he was sentenced to 7 years in prison. And he did go to prison. He is out of prison now. But that is a case of the experimentation industry hoping that scientific credentials are going to spare these people from what should happen to them.
And what happened to the science research while he was involved in all this legal stuff?
Presumably somebody else took over the laboratory. He's no longer in the animal experimentation business.
All right. So now another question. A skeptic would say, all right, these, you gave me two cases. They could be connected, but we're dealing with a small sample size. We're dealing with something that could be coincidental, anecdotal. I'm just saying that if you want to make the case that they're related, what do you think you need to prove to skeptics that there is a connection?
Psychological evaluations of the people who conduct these experiments. That's what we need. No, we can't say this outright, that if you experiment on animals that you have psychological problems. And in fact, I don't believe that. I don't think that all people who experiment on animals are deviants in some way. But I do think that we've uncovered enough cases that it raises the question about the suitability of some people to take public funding and to do the work that they're doing.
I mean, that's a key word, public funding, or key phrase, public funding, because these people are entrusted with tens of millions of dollars, right?
That's right.
To do the experiments in the name of what? The public good, really, in the name of science, but it's really with public dollars. They should be doing it for the public good, presumably, right?
That's right. Yes. And I would think that, to use the analogy you made earlier of the Catholic Church, if you had 1 or 2 or 17 examples of priests who had abused humans, children or adults or anybody, if you had 17 examples out of many, many, many churches, well, that's not a lot, but it certainly is enough to start asking questions.
And so you go back to what we started out with earlier, the idea of PETA wrote a letter to the Department of HHS saying that there needs to be psychological evaluations for anyone who wants to receive money to experiment on animals.
That's right.
And what kind of response did you get from the Department of HHS?
They have not deigned to respond to our request, which I think is one of the issues within the animal experimentation and the government research community, is that they believe they're above questioning. They believe that they are above any sort of examination or consideration of factors such as these.
So arrogance, in a way.
Arrogance, control, manipulation. These are all some of the traits that I began to recognize from that, what you could call a silly Netflix show, but which resonated with me. That there is this attitude among so many animal experimenters that they are smarter than everybody else, and that everybody else is basically put there for their pleasure to use in whatever way they see fit.
So basically, this is a show that inspired your research. It's a show about profiling people who do bad things. And so I guess you figured, well, why don't we profile the experimenters, the vivisectors? Is that how the path to your research took hold?
Very much so, although it was strangely easy. One of the first people I came up with was a man involved in a crime that had happened not long before, a man named Wyndham Latham. And he was arrested in July of 2017 in Illinois, charged with the murder of his 26-year-old boyfriend. And at the time of his arrest, he was an associate professor at Northwestern University. He infected mice with bubonic plague. That was his area of research. He'd been awarded more than $3 million toward his experiments in public money. And according to the prosecutors, Latham and another man from England, whom he'd communicated with online for many months about their shared sexual fantasy about killing other people. According to prosecutors, they said that Wyndham Latham and this person he'd been talking to from England murdered his boyfriend one night by stabbing him more than 70 times, just because they had this idea this might be a fun thing to do. It might be a gratifying thing to do, according to the prosecutors. The last words he reportedly spoke were, "Wyndham, what are you doing?" He was arrested. He confessed. He's in prison right now, awaiting his sentencing, awaiting his trial. And one of the ironies of this story is that after the COVID pandemic broke out, he suggested to prosecutors that he was too valuable to be in prison. He needed to be out where he could make his contributions to science.
That's pretty, all these things are pretty gruesome. Was there a correlation between what you found they experimented in and what they did to other humans?
There was some sharing of drugs. As I mentioned in one of the previous cases, the Nembutal. There was an animal experimenter also who murdered his wife, and he had ordered the cyanide into his laboratory in order to have the medication to poison her with, or to have the chemical to poison her with. So there was that kind of overlap that we saw. Other than that, what we saw basically was some really horrendous animal experiments and then tremendous violence toward humans. And that seems to be the key connection.
So in some ways, it was like the vivisector in his personal life looked on other human beings in his life as being kind of no different than the animals he experimented on.
Very much so. And that was what struck me. It was stunning to see these kinds of connections. There's another man, William French Anderson, who's been called the father of gene therapy. And he got that title by doing lots of experiments on monkeys and mice, rats, rabbits, sheep. He was the director of the gene therapy laboratories at University of Southern California. And he also did radiation studies on mice to test certain experimental drugs. He got more than $2 million in public funding for his experimentation. But in 2004, he was arrested for sexually abusing the daughter of his assistant, who said that he had offered to teach the little girl martial arts at his house. She was 10 years old when he began this abuse. It went on for some years before she reported it to another adult, what was going on. And what she said of this experience to the courtroom was, and I quote here, "He maliciously destroyed my world to fulfill his own sick pleasures." He got away with as much as he could. And his only comment about this, for quite some time, he avoided confessing to it, although he did brag that he was treated like a godfather in prison. But what he told somebody who was wearing a police wire was, "I just did it. Just something in me was evil."
There's something about when you have power as an experimenter over, say, a lab animal, and you're experimenting on that. It sounds like there's a transference to the domination one feels toward other human beings that they deal with.
I think that is sometimes the case. And I certainly, as I say, I certainly wouldn't say that of everybody. But I do think there is that attitude. There was an experimenter at the University of Washington National Primate Research Center named Michael Katz. And he was eventually, after many years of complaints about him, fired for sexual harassment and for racist comments he made to students who were Asian Americans. And he basically said, I don't care what you say about me. It's my job to get grants and do experiments. And he felt very much that he was above any kind of being held to account for any of his actions.
So you've now, in the course of our interview, have mentioned about 5 or 6 cases. You said you have 17. Was it, I mean, I don't know how much time you spent on this, but was it hard to come up with these cases, or did they just, suddenly there they were installed there as you looked at, the hundreds of people who get NIH grants, and you look at their public research, and then you find, I guess you either find some kind of link in the public record to major crimes, because some of these crimes are not insignificant. I mean, they must have created or caused news in their various locales.
I'm sorry to say it was easy to find these people. It was easy on simple Google searches to come up with people who had lucrative careers, and sometimes, in some cases, for many years, who had committed crimes of molestation, rape, murder, or harassment. That was easy. What was a little more difficult is that we were very, very careful with the evidence that we compiled. We looked at court records. We looked at all the news accounts of it, everything that we have put on our website in our feature called Sex, Violence, and Vivisection. Everything that we included on that website was very carefully researched and documented before we put it up there. Finding the details was not always easy. And so that was something we took very seriously.
So it sounds to me like the big question is, if PETA wants the Department of HHS to do these tests, psychological evaluations, they haven't said anything yet, but if the psychological evaluations were conducted, and if they had been conducted when these folks that you mentioned were experimenting, were vivisectors, do you think it would have made a difference? Do you think it would have changed things either on the animal front or on the human front?
I think it has the potential to change things. I do. Whether it would have, I can't say. I think this is like so many of these cases where links are made between the abuse of one being and the abuse of others. Some of this has yet to be verified and proven. As I said, we know there's a link between the abuse of animals and the abuse of humans. And this is why in cases of, for example, spousal abuse, when the police come to a home, they will remove the children and they will remove the animals too, because it's likely that if a spouse is abusing another spouse, everybody who's in that home is in trouble. And in cases of children and teenagers who abuse animals, they're often watched very carefully because that link. We know that many people who go on to harm other human beings began by harming humans. I think it's worth a look. And I also think the case of John Hagman makes that point probably better than anything else that we uncovered.
What was Hagman's case again?
Well, this was the very first one that we worked on, and this was before I had taken a look at the crimes committed by animal experimenters. And we found John Hagman's story through court records, but he was on our radar long before we knew about his abuse of humans, because he owns a company that was called Deployment Medicine International, DMI. It was a leading contractor for the U.S. military, and he provided trauma training courses for soldiers. And we've done a lot of work to try to end these courses and have ended quite a few of them across the military and entirely in the Coast Guard. And these are supposedly surgical training courses. But what happens is that goats and pigs are shot, stabbed, dismembered by medical personnel in the military who are going to go overseas. We know, just by way of background, that this is not good training. It's not good to try on one species what you must ultimately do in another. And there are simulators that can replace animals. So we were working very hard on ending this training. So John Hagman, as a physician and somebody who was in the military who had started this company, and just from 2013 to 2018 had $12 million worth of federal contracts, he was already on our radar. What we found in court cases is that he had been accused by numerous members of the military of sexual abuse. And he had put service members, men and women in the military, in really dangerous situations where he allegedly physically and sexually assaulted them and drugged them during these courses. And he seemed, in fact, to get a bizarre kind of sexual gratification by performing the inappropriate physical exams on other students, on the students, and then requesting them to perform them on him as well.
So what happened ultimately? Was Hagman caught, charged, and were things changed in how he dealt with things in the research world?
Yes, it was both satisfying and unsatisfying. The first thing is that the court found that there was cause to consider these accusations legitimate, but this was a court that was determining whether or not he should have a medical license. So he was never criminally tried for any of this, but he did lose his license with the military when we brought this to their attention. We further brought it to the attention of the state of Washington, where he had a medical license and he lost his medical license there. The company was dissolved. He was barred from getting any federal contracts for a period of 10 years. And eventually the North Carolina Medical Board also removed his license. But this is a person who harmed possibly hundreds of soldiers and other military professionals and never faced any criminal proceedings over it.
All right. So he was caught, but really was it an accident that they caught him? I mean, he continued doing this for a long time before he was stopped.
He did it for years. I think that's the shocking thing. And it was the bravery of some service members who came forward to report it that finally brought it to the attention of the medical board in North Carolina. And so that's how that happened. But we had done an investigation of one of his training courses. Now, this was a training program where Hagman himself was not present, but there was a weird kind of culture among the trainers in his course. And we found a very weird kind of attitude where lots of sexual references were made. We do have Hagman on video saying, he talks about, for example, a blood bag that is full enough to squeeze. And forgive me for saying this, but Hagman said this blood bag should feel like a boob. Just making these completely inappropriate references when there were both men and women. Not that it's ever okay for any gender, but there were both men and women in the class.
So it sounds like there was, in some of these examples, sex played a big part, or sexual gratification, and the power that these experimenters had over people in in human life, as aside from experimentation. So that has to be a big part of power, right?
It's very much in line with the kinds of things we do see among some animal experimenters, that the other beings, whether they're human, the human victims of sexual assault or molestation, that they are there basically for the gratification of the person who's abusing them. Just as some animal experimenters see that the animals in the laboratory are there for their own use, for their own publication glory, for their own research, without really any consideration for the animals themselves.
And once again, these people wouldn't be caught unless there was some kind of slip up, or unless someone was brave enough to go forward and file charges. I mean, aside from those two ways, they could have carte blanche on anything if they wanted, these vivisectors. It just doesn't sound like there's enough checks or enough control or enough oversight put on them to prevent these kind of abuses.
I'm not sure if you mean by abuses what's done to the animals or what's done to the humans, but I think it's applicable to both. I really do. I mean, if we look at the so-called oversight of animals in laboratories, there is hardly any. There really isn't. It's a paperwork issue.
Well, let me go at it this way. Were the experiments so heinous that they could have predicted what these people did in their regular human lives, or was it just standard run-of-the-mill kind of vivisection?
I think it would be hard to draw conclusions from what we have. I think we can say that in some cases, the experiments were particularly horrifying, and I've mentioned some of them already. And those to me are deeply, deeply disturbing and upsetting. And and that is why I do think that the question is worth asking. It's worth asking. Now, again, that's not to say that everybody who experiments on animals has this kind of psychological problem, or even people that do hideous experiments on animals necessarily would go on to harm humans. But if there's a question about it, which I think there is, which I think this evidence raises, then it certainly is worth an examination.
So once again, the PETA request of HHS is to have a psychological evaluation at the beginning of funding, during funding, or as if someone is applying for a grant. How would that work? And would that be considered uh, extraneous or going beyond, say, privacy issues, or would there be a claim for an experiment to say that's going too far? No, it's none of your business.
I think those are questions that probably a review panel at HHS would have to take up. They would have to look at that carefully. I would say that as a taxpayer and as somebody who spends most of my waking hours trying to figure out how to prevent the atrocities that occur against animals in laboratories, we have every right to ask whether or not the people who are harming these animals are dangerous in other ways as well. Some of the experiments that I have seen on animals, and I'm talking beyond these cases where we've seen what happens to human beings, some of the stuff I have seen done to animals is so horrendous that I have quite honestly thought, has this person got a psychological problem? Is this a psychopath who's found a way to feed that psychopathy in the laboratory? I mean, I honestly have thought that. I don't know the answer to that. I think we deserve an answer to that. And I think just as anybody who goes to a Catholic church has the right now to ask, is this a safe place for anybody to be? I think we need to know what kind of people are we talking about when we're entrusting tens of millions of dollars to them.
If you see the kind of experiments that can be done to animals, there should be a concern. But right now, I guess there isn't, because people separate science and they say that's science and personal stuff is none of our business.
There is an attitude in the scientific community that people who are not scientists, and even more than that, not scientists with expertise in their area, have no right to question what they do. And their attitude is that we must all have deference for their great scientific minds. And this, I think, is a grave mistake, because everything suffers. Are humans at risk? Probably not very often, but sometimes, and enough to be worried about. Animals are always at risk. Science itself is at risk. When we have been following the work of an experimenter who captures sparrows and other small birds and has done simply horrendous things to them. And her excuse is that she is studying stress in wild animals, because basically the world is a stressful place and we need to know what's going to happen to species of animals in stress, under stressful conditions. We have to be concerned about these animals. We have to be concerned about what's being done to them and why. And it might sound reasonable in a paper that somebody has done something, but if you step back and take a look at it, science itself is suffering right along with the animals.
And so right now, you're awaiting a response from HHS. Vivisectors still can receive money and still do their thing. And are there people who are potential victims out there, you think, given the kind of, just how widespread, research is and, throughout the land? I mean, is there a real concern? Or, I mean, like I said, you got 17 examples here that you cited. If people did more of a survey, would they find more, you think?
I suspect that's very likely true. We don't have access to all records. We have done a beginning. We've started something here. But if you look at somebody like Tracy McIntosh, who's the man I mentioned early on, who raped the niece of a colleague of his, after drugging her with Nembutal. If you look at his case, what surfaced later were many, many accusations of sexual abuse. So this niece wasn't just a one-time thing. This had happened a lot. And Michael Katz at University of Washington, years of complaints about sexual harassment, inappropriate suggestions of intimate contact, racist comments. Because we know about, in some cases, the one victim who came forward and got action taken, doesn't mean that there weren't dozens of others.
So is there a more proactive way to go about trying to stop this?
Yes, we can do psychological evaluations. I think it's a place to start. Now, are there people who do terrible things who aren't animal experimenters? Without question. But we've raised this connection, and I think it's worth a follow-up.
So people who are interested in the research that you've done, where can they go, and what can they do to force the Department of Health and Human Services to do more?
They can go to PETA.org, or they can Google the title of the piece that's on our website, Sex, Violence, and Vivisection, it's called. And there is an action at the end, an action step. People can send an email to the Department of Health and Human Services. So far, 50,000 people have requested this of HHS.
50,000.
Mm-hmm.
You've been doing this a while, fighting for the animals, trying to save animals' lives. Is this the most, I don't want to say the most gruesome thing, but because vivisectors aren't necessarily good people. You've seen that, but is this sort of does this take it in terms of proving to you, in your mind, that vivisectors aren't well, or that they are capable of doing these dangerous, hideous things to humans?
This proves to me that some of them are. I'm certainly not going to say that about all of them, although many of them do really terrible things to animals, and that's profoundly disturbing as well. But certainly not all animal experimenters go this far. I do think people should look at the cases that we've profiled, because it is shocking. It's horrifying. When you see what people have done, true crime, as we all know, is a horrifying thing. But the reason that we spotlight it is to try to prevent similar situations in the future.
You've cited these cases, but you can't make the generalization to make this a bona fide profile, right?
I don't think we can say that about all animal experimenters. And in fact, I think many animal experimenters are people who are looking for a way out, or don't know they're looking for a way out and haven't found it yet. I know many people who used to experiment on animals who are good people, and they got out of it because they couldn't take it. And I think there are a lot of the people who stay in it because they believe that this is what they have to do in order to publish, and they have to publish in order to stay employed by their university. And this is the paradigm they know. They don't know what they're going to do if it's changed. This is all very dangerous for science, of course, and certainly deadly for animals. But I wouldn't say by any means that every animal experimenter meets this profile. I just repeat, some do. Let's take a look at it. Let's question it.
Kathy Guillermo, Senior VP of Laboratory Investigations, on sex, violence, and vivisection. Read more at PETA.org. That's the article on PETA.org. And take action. Demand that the Department of Health and Human Services require psychological testing of applicants before getting any money for research on animals. And that's our show this time out. Hey, thank you for listening. You can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or on AMOK.com, or see my work at ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. That's at AALDEF.org/blog. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts, where you can rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music is provided by Carbon Works. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.